Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Tim Besley, and I'm a member of the Economics Department here at the LSE, and I'd like to wish you a warm welcome this evening for this discussion of Meghnad Desai's new book, Hubris: Why Economists Failed to Predict the Crisis and How to Avoid the Next One. Meghnad has a long association with the LSE, having spent almost all of his career here in the Economics Department, following his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in 1963. Originally from Gujarat, India, Meghnad has played a distinguished role in public and academic life in the UK. He's been a member of the House of Lords since 1990. Meghnad is an economist of extraordinary breadth, which will be apparent when you see him in action in a moment. His work spanned from the finer points in econometric methods to Marxist economics. It's been a personal privilege to have been Meghnad's colleague here at the LSE. In my experience, he always offers both a refreshing and informed opinion on almost any issue you discuss with him. My favorite two stories of Meghnad both involve dismissal. One case where he wasn't dismissed and one where he was. It may be difficult to believe when you see this picture of serenity with me on the stage this evening that Meghnad was once a firebrand and supported the student demonstrations for which LSE was famous in the 1960s. And I remember him telling me that the only reason he didn't lose his job was because he'd just published a paper in Econometrica, one of the leading and most admired journals in economics. But I believe that Meghnad had not long been in the House of Lords when he was in fact fired from the Labour front bench for expressing his views about extending VAT, a topic on which actually I believe he was correct, and the Merleys Review on which I served came to the same conclusion as Meghnad. The moral of that story, of course, is that LSE is a much more tolerant and open-minded institution than the Labour Party, but we probably knew that already. I know that we're in for a treat this evening when he develops the ideas in his book. Moreover, he'll be available for a book signing right after the lecture. Since Meghnad's book is intended to provoke debate, we thought that we'd get this going right away by inviting two distinguished and knowledgeable discussants. Stephen King is a Group Chief Economist of HSBC and a prolific author with a wide-ranging knowledge of the global economy. He was also at the sharp end of the economic crisis in his day job. Charles Goodhart has been a member of the LSE Economics and Finance community for many years, having been a professor of economics here and founder of the Financial Markets Group. He was a founding member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee and had a number of influential advisory roles in the great LSE tradition of spanning academia and practical policy making. After Meghnad has introduced some of the main ideas, I'll invite Stephen and Charles to respond before opening the floor to questions and discussion. Without any further delay, let me introduce Meghnad Desai.
Thank you, Tim, very much. This was in the good old days when I was a fiery rebel. This place looked much tattier, but much more crowded than it used to be now. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to my friends and many, many old acquaintances. The book had actually a very dull title to begin with. I called it The Economic Crisis and the Crisis of Economics. And my publisher said, it's just too boring a title. So we'll give it a title, and you jazz up the book a little bit so that it'll be interesting. But it has been written for non-economists. It's written for anybody who'll read it. And it first of all wants to, the book, is in sort of three parts. It first of all wants to answer the question Her Majesty the Queen asked when she opened that building in LSE. Why didn't anybody tell us? So first of all, is why did economists fail to predict the recession? For that, you have to understand why do economists think the way they do. And for that, you have to know the history of economic ideas. So the first third of the book more or less describes how economists got hooked on the idea of equilibrium, and how the idea of equilibrium has nothing whatsoever to do with mathematics, because Ricardo was able to argue that without any algebra. And quite convincingly, Ricardo fixed the parameters of that game. and we have been there ever since. So the first bit traces through in the history of economic ideas, very kind of, at a fast pace. Smith, Ricardo, Walras, and later on Marshall, things like that, Arrow the Brew. And so idea that economists took to the idea of equilibrium is a very powerful, simplifying, organizing idea. When the reality looks very chaotic, reality looks very, very chaotic, and you can't really make sense of all these things going on, prices and quantities and people, millions of people independently making decisions. And Adam Smith wanted to say, there is an interconnectedness in the system, the invisible hand. I mean, this is an interconnected system, but you can't see the interconnections. It is like almost subterranean interconnections, all driven by self-interest. Ricardo then basically sat down and proved that supply creates its own demand. And there's a marvelous episode in the second volume of the complete works of Ricardo that Sraffa edited. There is Malthus's book with Ricardo's marginal comments. And every time Malthus gets close to arguing that there might be a glut, especially in 200 years ago, when a Waterloo battle was won, then of course government started cutting expenditure, and Malthus said, there is in this unemployed labor and unemployed capital, and Ricardo said it's not possible. There cannot be any unemployed capital and unemployed labor, because if there is supply, there will be a demand for it. And poor Malthus pointed out facts, and Ricardo Morris said, facts have nothing to do with this. This is a matter of theory. And the surprising thing was that Ricardo was a very practical man. He was a stockbroker, member of parliament, landlord, and he could entertain some extremely abstract ideas so convincingly that for about 200 years economists stuck to the simple way Ricardo had constructed the subject for us. And all that happens later on is that, with Walras and so on, we change the kind of from labor theory of value to marginal utility and opportunity cost theory of the value, but the world remains the same. The economist's world is almost always in equilibrium, because that's the way with initial assumptions and ruthless logic, you can establish that there is equilibrium. And no amount of empirical facts are going to move that, because economists think that is just hand waving. Where is your proof? And so later on, Marshall tried to kind of write in simpler ways the same thing, but he kind of made it look like he was telling stories of the real world, average cost and marginal cost, and how marginal cost cuts the average cost, and it's so beautiful. The diagram, Marshall got diagrams, and people started believing that there are things like marginal cost and marginal revenue which firms look at, and profit goes to zero in equilibrium and all that. We all believe that. Somehow we have students who graduate and go work in the city, and then they realize that the world doesn't work like that. But they're properly equipped to make their own adjustments, but not lose faith in economics. That's a great secret. In old days, people used to be trained in theology and then become ministers to kings, like Thomas Cromwell. You learn theology, but then with that training of the mind, you could solve practical problems without losing your faith in theology. Anyway, then what happens? Then we have Keynes. Keynes is the first person to object to the idea of a unique equilibrium. And he said, no, there might be two equilibria, not just one. And one equilibrium is the full employment equilibrium, and the other equilibrium is involuntary equilibrium. And most of you are too young to remember what an amazingly exciting thing it was for many, many people, that for the first time economics began to talk about the real world, people thought. Keynes was able to explain that, yes, free market economy, so-called, could get trapped into a situation of involuntary unemployment. And the important point was it was a stable equilibrium. It was equilibrium out of which you could not easily get out by natural forces. It needed a push from an autonomous, non-market related force. And that's why public investment became such an important thing, because public investment was not driven by considerations of profits or price or things like that. But because, in a sense, there were two equilibria, they were both locally stable, if I may call them, and it was difficult, if an economy got trapped into unemployment equilibrium, difficult to get it out. Now, second part of this book, therefore, explains how triumphant Keynes's idea was in the 30s and 40s, and how it became part of textbooks in the 50s and 60s. And many, many politicians of a certain generation didn't read anything else except that. And even now in the debates, there are people who still believe that what Keynes said was the fundamental truth, and it cannot be challenged. I mean, there's a man called Anthony Crosland who wrote a book called The Future of Socialism. Some of you may have heard of socialism, so I'm reminding you. And his idea was that Keynes had more or less solved the problems of capitalism. There was going to be full employment. But Keynes had also shown that if you could redistribute income from the rich who save too much to the poor who consume a lot, then redistribution is not only progressive, but economically efficient. And he therefore thought that the Labour Party would then rule forever because they had the key to making capitalism fair and efficient. Didn't happen like that, sadly. But now, when I came here in '65, I had been more or less brought up on the idea that there was only Keynesian macroeconomics. There was nothing else available. And during my time here, especially in the 70s onwards, I could see the disintegration of Keynesian economics by internal criticism within the academic profession. And the objection to Keynes and theoretical debates about Keynesian theory and policy framework were very much fought in academic terms, of course, with prose and algebra and econometrics and so on, but especially Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was an extremely important person because he had a very structured mind. He never wrote anything which was just to show off that he could do it. I mean, Paul Samuelson had that problem. He just wanted to show off that he could do a bit of mathematics. Milton Friedman was a very, very focused political economist. Everything he did had a purpose, and there was kind of architecture to his work. But even before we get to that, one of the Keynes's thing was that he tried to show that the reason why there is unemployment is because everything else works in neoclassical economics, he said. But the labor market has got a problem. The demand for labor is all right, works according to theory, marginal product, real wage, so on. But the supplier of labor cannot control how many hours he would work, and he cannot equate the marginal distributed labor to the real wage, because bargaining takes place in terms of money wage, not in terms of real wage. Now, it's very strange. If that was true of the supplier of labor, why wasn't it true of the demand for labor? How come the demand renews the real wage and supply them? But that doesn't matter. A lot of the subsequent debate hinged on the fact that the orthodox theory said, you have assumed money wage rate to be given, and it's a rigidity of money which causes unemployment. Remove that assumption, and your theory is destroyed. And so it became one of the problems of economics. That did Keynes's theory depend upon rigidity of money wages? Now, us Keynesians believed that was not the case, but most other people, and that began to be the entry point of the orthodox opposition to Keynes. And I explained how there was, first of all, a fatal embrace by Hicks with his ISLM model, we could read about it, and then how people again and again said, the problem with Keynesian macroeconomics is that it doesn't dovetail with the microeconomics we teach. In microeconomics, all markets clear. In microeconomics, we don't worry about money wage. We worry only about relative prices, real wages, And how come suddenly we got this something called macroeconomics talks about money wages? Keynesian economics had no micro foundations. And so a lot of battle back and forth, some of which you can read in the book. And Milton Friedman, as I was saying, very systematically, first of all, he questioned the Keynes' theory of the consumption function. Then he moved on to Keynes' theory of inflation. Keynes didn't really discuss inflation very much. He discussed something about price changes. And during the war, he wrote something about how to combat inflation. But it was in LSE that Bill Phillips, who was here when I joined, A.W.H. Phillips, had this Phillips curve. Phillips curve related inflation to unemployment, empirically. And Keynesians thought that was the theory of inflation. Too much unemployment, prices won't rise. Too little unemployment, inflation. So if you don't want inflation, increase unemployment, which is somewhat uncomfortable for Keynesians because they're also somewhat left-wing. So then we had incomes policies and things like that. Anyway, Milton Friedman said, this is complete nonsense because Phillips curves in terms of money, wages, and unemployment, the rate of change of money and unemployment. And economics has nothing to say about how money, wage related to unemployment. Economics has to have real wages relate to unemployment. And just at about that time, late 60s, early 70s, inflation started accelerating. Wage bargaining became very, very contentious. And people realized that workers were bargaining not just about money wages like that, but money wages on the basis of expected inflation rates, which makes common sense. So it wasn't right what Keynes was saying, that the worker can't bargain about real wages. He was bargaining about real wages, but based on inflationary expectation. So the bargain was about money wage based on inflation expectation. If that is true, then a Phillips curve doesn't exist. You cannot, given the rate of money wage inflation, determine unemployment, or you cannot from unemployment determine the rate of inflation. That proved to be a very basic objection to the entire Keynesian edifice. And first, Milton Friedman's presidential address in 1968, and later on what Robert Lucas did, it became clear that there was no such thing as Keynesian economics. Keynes economics has no micro foundations. There could not be a Phillips curve. Unemployment was determined in many, many micro markets. And whatever unemployment existed was just sum total of a variety of different markets. So in some sense, neoclassical theory, excuse me. Okay. This is my wife calling me from Goa. I can't talk to her. So in a sense, what they were saying that, you see, in neoclassical theory, in Ricardo or Walras, you don't need macroeconomics at all, because the variety of individual markets equilibrate, and the macro is a sum total of the micro. Only thing you need for macroeconomics is the quantity theory of money, because micro only determines relative prices. To determine nominal prices, you need MV equals PT. So in a sense, by the time we got to the end of what was called neoclassical macroeconomics, in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, everything that Keynes had said had been more or less shown to be not consistent with microeconomics. So if you think, people started saying about as if economics was a building, it had to have micro foundations. Macro was up there, it had to have micro foundations. But if you really have sound micro foundations, you don't need macro. You can just be an open terrace at the top and you're all right. So at least within my academic lifetime here, I could see the rise and fall of Keynesian economics until we stopped teaching. I should also say parenthetically that soon after the general theory was published in 1936, when Hicks wrote his brilliant article about IS and LM, everybody stopped reading the general theory, because if you could do it in 10 pages, who wants to read 350 pages? But I was brought up in a backward department, so we had to read the text. And then I went to Pennsylvania, where I had a teacher called Sidney Weintraub, who more or less said all neoclassical economics was junk, and the only true book was Keynesian, Keynes's General Theory. So I've got addicted to it. But quite true that most people had decided that there's nothing to Keynesian economics. We had to get back to neoclassical economics. Now, there still remained something about the practical policy issue. People thought, yeah, you may not be right, but in real life, there are imperfections and rigidities and things like that. So maybe fiscal policy would be effective. Especially fiscal policy would be effective at the bottom of the cycle. And the new classical macroeconomics people say, no, that is not actually true, because if you decide to spend money, economic agents are so rational that they can figure out that that money will have to be paid for by increasing taxation in the future, and therefore the sum total of the saving they will make to pay the tax in the future would cancel out the multiplier effect of the fiscal push. You need infinitely lived people for that, but the integral works. So there was this very, very the great contrast between most politicians of either left or right still believed in Keynesian economics. Many newspaper editorial writers believed, and in the academia, it had been pushed. Then, of course, we had this 2008 crisis. Now, I quote Lucas in saying that, if you live in a world of rational expectations and efficient markets, it is not possible to predict such a big change. I mean, it is not within a capability of the theoretical structure to be able to predict an extreme event like this. Or if anybody could have predicted an extreme event, it would not have happened because people would have taken countervailing actions. That is the essence of new classical economics. And I have great admiration for Lucas. I think he really is an amazingly great economist, because he honestly sees what the problem is and what the limitations of his own theory is. He doesn't fudge and doesn't make excuses. He said, no, this cannot be done, not within. So the last part of my book says, okay, it is possible to say that if you have lived since 1945 to say 2008, 63 years, and you haven't really had a serious economic crisis in that data set. And quite a lot of the time what economists did was they looked at a data set, they fitted a trend, they looked at fluctuations around the trend, and it looked like fluctuation around the trend did not have any cycle. They were kind of, I won't go into technicality, but Now, so it's quite right. If within your data set there has not been a big shock like this, how can a model predict it? Well, the answer to that is there's a much larger data set, which goes back 200 years, in which there are frequent crises and cycles. And certainly, again, to go autobiographical, when I was doing my master's degree in Bombay, we had a paper called Fluctuations and Growth, and there are serious textbooks written on business cycles. Within 10 years of my doing MA, graduated in 1960, there was a book called Is the Business Cycle Obsolete? And that was written by sort of proto-Keynesians. And people said, no, Keynes has eliminated business cycle. There is no such problem. And therefore, So economists stopped discussing business cycles. And the debates were really about, micro foundations of macroeconomics. So here we have an experience which was outside anybody's historical sample. But go back 200 years, start say in 1780s to 2010, let's say, and there are many cycles. And so I go back to some very old-fashioned, completely neglected bits of economics to construct the alternative argument, which may explain. And that consists of what Marx said about business cycles. He was the first person to talk about business cycle. There was a man called Goodhart who had measured cycles, but didn't have a theory. And Marx's theory of business cycle was roughly in terms of the struggle between wage share and profit share. That there was a cyclical component to when the labor market got tight, wage share went up, profit share went down, but then capitalists replaced labor with machinery or went out of business, and then you had so wage share fell, profit share rose. But as soon as that happened, more people came into the market and started hiring workers. And there is a modern analog written 100 years after Marx wrote his Capital Volume 1 by a man called Richard Goodwin, who did the game of foxes and rabbits, which some of you may know. Foxes eat rabbits. If foxes eat too many rabbits, the rabbits' population declines. Foxes starve. While foxes are starving, rabbits' population grows. So by the time rabbits are gone, the foxes can start eating rabbits again, and you get in this cyclic situation. And he formulated that as a pair of nonlinear differential equations. So it's a beautiful model. I did a lot of work on that. And their idea is that there are cycles in wage share and profit share, which Marx thought were roughly 10 years. But, the length of the cycle will depend upon its parameters of the model. Then there was Schumpeter, who said, Marx's theory of instability of capitalism and all that is not really, he's sort of too negative. The real thing is that entrepreneurs come on the scene, there are innovations, and innovations are 50-year-long cycles. And big innovations like cotton spinning revolution, in the 70s and 80s, and railroads, then at the end of the 19th century, electricity and all that. And these innovations set of 50-year cycles, which are involved with credit creation, inflation, and then profits go up and then profits go down again. And economics of capitalism is explained by a series of 50-year cycles. And the third man was, and then of course there's Wicksell. Wicksell was a late 19th century economist. He believed in the truth of Walrasian system. But he also saw that there were business cycles. So he said, there is a problem here which I have to solve. Walrasian system has no money. It's based on barter. So if I can integrate money into the system, and he had a theory that basically cycles arose because the rate of interest at which banks were willing to lend money was sometimes below the rate of profit. So there are a lot of people borrowing money, investing it, the boom starts because people are scrambling around making money, and after a while the banks panic and put up the interest rate, and a lot of people go out of business. So he had a cycle based on the money and credit effects of profit rate versus interest rate. And then there was a man called Kondratiev. Kondratiev was a young Russian statistician who established a research center, and he dated 50-year cycles from 1780s onwards, roughly 50-year cycles. And these are heuristic devices. Nobody has really sat down and created a research center to put real mathematical meat into all these arguments. I mean, it could be done. Somebody could do it. If I was 40 years younger, I would devote some time to doing it, but somebody else will do it if they find it interesting. But the idea is that there are these suggestive things around, and maybe economics ought to explore this kind of underground macroeconomics, which we have forgotten, and maybe there is something there to create the next. I'm sure there are some new ideas needed, like behavioral economics, whatever it is, but the old ideas are also there, which we could kind of, retrieve and reverse. Okay, can I take 5 more minutes?
5 more minutes.
Okay. The last part of the book is my story of what happened and why it happened. And my story of what happened and why it happened, again, sort of goes around. So after the war, after the Second World War, for about 25 years, we have a Keynesian boom, 45 to 70. wage share goes up very, very sharply. The whole Phillips curve thing is popular because wage share is going up. Wages are rising faster than productivity. Profits are being squeezed. And in says one way inflation was a solution to maintain that kind of peace between the fights between wages and profits. But then, early in the 70s, we have almost by accident. Well, there are two things happen. First of all, the Americans renege on the commitment to maintain dollar gold link. The Bretton Woods system collapses. And secondly, oil prices quadruple. And that begins a downward cycle. Downward cycle we used to call stagflation. Unemployment rising, inflation high, and so we had that problem. Wage share reaches a peak in early 70s, and then has not regained that level ever since. In America, the effect was much more severe. What happened? What happened from developed countries? Manufacturing migrated abroad. The squeeze on profits when the people who wanted to make profit in manufacturing decided that you could no longer locate it in developed economies. It went to Asia. And everybody saw Mrs. Thatcher destroyed manufacturing. Mrs. Thatcher was just part of the Conservative cycle. And it all went to Asia. And suddenly industrialization of Asia takes place when deindustrialization of the West starts. And in the Western economies, we suddenly have a lower share of manufacturing in total income. The skilled and unskilled manual workers who had stable jobs, which, 48 years of your life, 48 weeks per year, 48 hours per week, as used to be said in a British trade union thing, suddenly that solid base disappeared. And there were service sector jobs, low-paid service sector jobs for the unskilled, high-wage service sector jobs for those who had graduates in finance and so on. And the whole growth of inequality very much arises from this removal of manufacturing as a stabilizing force for income lower down. And then as the economy recovers, sort of 73, but 20 years later, we get a recovery in the early 1990s. At that stage, there is recovery, but the workers' income have not really gone back to the old equilibrium. But the financial markets are very efficient, so borrowing is easy. So then you get kind of Excelian effect. People start borrowing. And we financed a boom based on borrowing, subprime mortgages, and so on. And that boom collapsed, and that upper phase of conservative cycle was short. 1990 to 2008, it collapsed then. And we may be, sad to say, in the downward phase of conservative, which will last 20 years. That's the good news I'm giving you. You'll have low growth and low inflation. I never thought when I was fighting the monetarists, or they were dominant, that central bankers would go around hoping for higher inflation. I mean, the shock of that, to me, I still get up every morning and how could this happen? Why? I thought inflation was such a danger that everybody thought we must get it down. Now there are poor central bankers worried about low inflation. And anyway, so as I said, there are no long-term universal laws in economics. There's kind of contingent things which happen. So read the last section, and you might find that explanation satisfying. So that that you have to think in terms of 50-year cycles within which there are wage profit cycles, there are VIXEL cycles, and altogether you can tell a story. Maybe not yet a fully mathematical story, but you can tell a story which will explain to you why. Now, in the second part of the subtitle of the book, it's a bit of a fraud. I'm not actually going to tell you how to avoid the next one. What I really mean, how to avoid missing out predicting the next one. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to now have a couple of responses to Meghnad, and I'll start with Stephen King and then move to Charles Goodhart.
Well, Meghnad, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for a really fascinating presentation. My first task is simply to to tell you all to buy the book because it is a really
Good
marvelous
man.
book.
Good
It's a
man.
marvelous book, and it appeals to two observations I'd make about the teaching of economics. I think it is not good enough in teaching economic history. I don't think it's good enough in teaching the history of economic thought. So put those two things together. If you feel as though you've missed out on some of those areas, his books are all in there, which is just wonderful. I wanted to make a few observations on belief, actually, about why it is that policymakers, economists believe so strongly in things that subsequently prove to be untrue. And I put together a series of quotes from various people, which, in hindsight, are quite amusing. So this one works as follows. We are talking here about homes where there is not the degree of leverage that we have seen elsewhere. This is not the dot-com situation. You're not going to see the collapse that you see when people talk about a bubble. Those of us on the House Finance Committee will continue to push for home ownership. That was Barney Frank in 2005. Another quote I quite like, because it's kind of relevant for today. First, if the housing bubble were to deflate on its own, would the effect on the economy be exceedingly large? Second, is it unlikely that the Fed could mitigate the consequences? And third, is monetary policy the best tool to use to deflate a house price bubble? My answers to these questions in the shortest possible form are no, no, and no. That was Janet Yellen in 2005. This one you'll immediately spot, I think. For 40 years, our economy has had an unenviable history under governments of both parties of boom and bust. So, against a background of mounting uncertainty and instability in the global economy, we set about establishing a new economic framework to secure long-term economic stability and put an end to the damaging cycle of boom and bust. That was Gordon Brown, of course, in 1997. Importantly, he didn't refer to Tory boom and bust, as he later claimed. He was referring to boom and bust from both parties over the previous few decades. Then perhaps more an academic approach here. This is from 2001. The decrease in output volatility was associated with and may have largely been caused by the decrease in inflation volatility that occurred around the same time. And the increased stability of inflation is likely to have been due in large part to better monetary policy. This is the beginnings of the whole debate or the whole observational claim about the great moderation. That was Olivier Blanchard, recently retired from the IMF in 2001. And this is backed up by another person who said in 2004, this conclusion, which is Blanchard's conclusion, makes me optimistic for the future because I am confident that monetary policymakers will not forget the lessons of the 1970s. That was Ben Bernanke. And then finally, another famous one here, this is in March 2003. My thesis is that macroeconomics in its original sense has succeeded. Its central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes and has in fact been solved for many decades. That was Robert Lucas in March 2003. So one sort of observation about all this is why is it that those who might be willing to say things might go wrong are typically not listened to? Why is it that during the good times, policymakers, many economists, politicians, all want to believe that the good times will continue and that when there are warnings that perhaps things will go wrong, those warnings are typically unheeded? So actually you mentioned at the very beginning of your book, you talk about various people who got part of the story right, and you mentioned Nouriel Roubini. I wasn't sure that Roubini got it right because I had to reread the speech he gave at the IMF in 2006, but actually when you read the speech, it's not bad. It sort of makes a series of observations and predictions that arguably were broadly right, but he wasn't taken terribly seriously. I have my own personal experience of this. Well, I'm not taken terribly seriously all the time, of course, but in this particular case, I'd written a piece back in 1999, which is called Bubble Trouble. And it was a prediction which, actually one of the few predictions I've ever got right, but it was a prediction that the US equity market was a bubble, that it was likely to burst and that there could be some kind of recession that would follow. And now my job at HSBC as an economist is really to go and see our esteemed clients and so on and tell them and give them advice as to what may or may not be going on. And I had huge difficulties with this story, in part because no one really wanted to believe it, in part because there were people who had absolutely convinced themselves that the new economy, as it was called at the time, was absolutely for real. And in one meeting in 2000, just before the NASDAQ bubble actually burst, this was a meeting in Germany, I was thrown out the meeting. I mean, not physically, of course, but I was asked to leave because the fund manager who was taking the meeting said, like, I've heard these stories of doom and gloom before. I have no interest in them. You just don't understand what is going on. So there was a kind of, almost like a psychosis of beliefs that persuaded people that somehow the problems really had been solved, or that if there was bubbly behavior going on, there was a rational explanation for it. Another example of this actually goes back to 1989. I can't remember exactly the word-for-word quote, but there was a quote in The Economist which suggested that in 1989, the Japanese had discovered ways of running their corporations which meant that genuinely they were worth 4 times, 8 times more than American companies or British companies. And The Economist published this in all seriousness that suggested that the Nikkei, at 39,000 was still a good buy. It was a good buy and a different kind of good buy, as it turned out. So I wonder why it is that these beliefs exist. And indeed, even when people warn that things might go wrong, there's a sort of a collective sense that things can't go wrong. And I also wonder whether this is partly the political process, that the economists and advisors who are sometimes selected to work for particular governments are selected precisely because they aren't going to rock the boat, or they're not going to challenge, they aren't going to question, and they're not going to warn of things that might eventually go wrong. So that might reveal that perhaps fashion is important in economics. I could perhaps call your book not just hubris, but also fashion, that things go in and out of fashion. And it turns out that some of those fashions are purely fashions and don't really have many foundations behind them. The second issue, which is related to this, is that macroeconomists have a habit of being really, I don't mean this in a rude way, it may come across as being rather rude, but being really quite arrogant about their particular views. They sometimes talk with great certainty about what their framework is for the world, whether it's a Keynesian framework or a monetarist framework. And of course, you've got the current debate between stimulards and austerians and so on. And this debate is very, very heated. And people have very, very strong beliefs, even though we know that estimates of the output gap, multipliers, and so on are hugely uncertain, but it doesn't stop people having these very powerful beliefs. And if you're interested in reading on that, Diane Coyle, a famous public intellectual in the UK, wrote a rather good piece in the FT on the Exchange website, which goes into this debate. And of course, as soon as she wrote it, she was attacked by many people who thought that she was daring to question their own arrogance, but I thought it was a perfectly reasonable article. So there's a sort of issue there. I was very, very pleased that you mentioned Schumpeter, and I have a question really, which is I wonder whether we've lost sight in recent years of some of the issues associated with Schumpeter and the idea of creative destruction and liquidation and so on. Because in thinking about the response to the crisis, we've had tremendously loose monetary conditions in many parts of the world. I wonder whether those loose monetary conditions have, if you like, allowed large, inefficient companies, I'm not referring specifically to banks here, but large, inefficient companies to remain large and inefficient, and whether as a consequence of that it's made it much more difficult for small startup companies to enter into certain industries, and as a consequence that may have been damaging from the point of view of productivity performance. So I just wonder whether there's a relevance currently for the poor productivity performance and whether that is in part a Schumpeterian story. I was, in one sense, surprised and at the same time delighted that you had all the comments about Kondratiev and Kondratiev waves, although I would note that in my experience on Kondratiev, I don't mean to be rude about him, but I discovered Kondratiev actually not through economics, but rather through the various technical analysts that work in the city who have an expertise which is the equivalent of divining things through tea leaves, as far as I can tell. I may be being very unfair about them, but they strongly believe in Kondratiev waves amongst another number of other ways. And I wonder whether as a consequence of their beliefs in them, it is difficult to persuade the mainstream that actually Kondratiev should be taken seriously. And you make the point yourself that in the book that I think there were, is it 6 waves since 1780 or something like that? Something like 6 waves. Although you said in your presentation that perhaps you could devise some kind of mathematical model for it, I think, well, if you've only got 6 observations, I wonder whether that really is going to work particularly well. So I just wonder about that. Just a few other sort of, I suppose, finishing remarks. The first is DSG models have become absolutely dominant across all central banks. I found that models, in the experience that I've had, which is fairly limited, but my team of economists at HSBC have often struggled to get the models to say anything useful. So when we did the work on bubble trouble back in 1999-2000, we tried to create a kind of model simulation that would give you a recession in response to a collapse in equity prices. The model that we used, and I won't say which one it was, it would be unfair, but the model we used made it totally impossible to create a recession. So effectively, the models being used by central banks and by others effectively rule out the really interesting things that matter for policymakers, which I think is really quite disappointing. On your explanation for what's happened and what may happen in the future, it clearly is a very interesting disequilibrium explanation. I like the idea that it's moved away from the whole issue of equilibrium. And I guess the way you would summarize it is it's a mixture of Kondratiev, Schumpeter, Marx, Hayek, and Wicksell. I think that's what you're kind of getting at. But this comes back again to the issue of fashion, which is if you were an economist working as a policy advisor saying, I've got this wonderful new Kondratiev, Schumpeter, Marx, Hayek, Wicksell model, I wonder how easy it would be to persuade the powers that be, the central bankers, the finance ministers, and so on, to take that model seriously. And I think one reason for that, one difficult reason is that, of course, the model may be saying things about the next 10, 20 years, and particularly in the Western democratic cycle, politicians are interested in the next 4 or 5 years and no more than that, and often interested in hard numbers and hard predictions rather than the risks around those predictions. So that strikes me as being a bit of an issue. And then finally, going back to the issue of disequilibrium, I wonder if you could perhaps offer some thoughts as to whether we have a disequilibrium currently. Specifically, that when you look at what's happened to financial asset prices in recent years, and you look at what's happened to economies in recent years, it seems to me that there's a potential disconnect between the two, what I describe as a kind of financial hope triumphing over economic reality. And I wonder whether that story can continue indefinitely. If it can't, how would that be eventually resolved? But first of all, finally, thank you very much. And I just stress it's a great book, so definitely go and buy it.
So, our next respondent is Charles Goodhart.
I first came to LSE in 1966. That was about a year after Meghnad had arrived. And he was more or less just the same then. He was just as enthusiastic, just as fluent, just as lovable then as he is now. And indeed, his hair has remained exactly the same, much like a wire brush. The only thing that has changed has been its color. I don't know, Meghnad, whether you were like me. One of the reasons I went into academic macroeconomics, was that I thought it was so bad that I might actually have a chance of making it a bit better. At the end of my career, I have to say I've failed. I don't know whether you have that same feeling, because...
The good guys failed.
Well, if anything, macroeconomics, in my view, is considerably worse now than it was about 50 years ago. And the golden age, when we were optimistic about it, was in the 1960s, when a combination of the arrival of computing power and a lot more data made us think that we would be able to undertake empirical work that would enable us to understand how the economy worked. And that, unfortunately, fell apart and has never really been reconstructed. And one of the reasons I think why it fell apart is because of the economists' love of the concept of equilibrium. And it's very difficult not to go back to that concept, because it's the way we tend as a profession to organize our thoughts. But yet I think it is very debilitating, because the world actually is not like that. And what happens is you get a shock, and if the shock is as large as the great financial crisis was, what then occurs is that you have many institutional, legal, and regulatory changes. And these change the framework in which we as individuals all live. And that means it changes our behavior in ways that is very difficult, in fact almost impossible, to work out in advance. So as our behavior changes in a new institutional context, what we will get is that fate will bring about other events, and we will therefore have other shocks, which will lead again to institutional, legal, and regulatory changes. So the whole process actually operates in a continuing evolution of disequilibrium rather than the static equilibrium, which economists, in order to make their own life easier, tend to work. And this kind of evolutionary disequilibrium is far, far harder to deal with, to be able to analyze. But because the economists, macroeconomists in particular, tend to live in a world which, even with trends and DSGE, is essentially one of static equilibrium, it means that all this sort of the interactions with other social disciplines tend to get lost. And I think that it leads to an oversimplification, to a lack of understanding and concern about the historical progress in process in which we are all operating. And Bob Lucas has been the leading figure in macroeconomics over the last sort of 25 years. And I agree that going to micro foundations was a good idea. The problem was that they went to the wrong micro foundations. The micro foundations that is involved in the DSGE models, the micro foundations, in fact, that are generally utilized, assume that financial system works perfectly. And for the financial system to work perfectly, it assumes that everyone with 100% probability carries out all their commitments and contracts. There is no default in any of this. If there's no default, you don't need financial intermediaries like banks. You don't need Stephen. That might be a nice result, but unfortunately, we have to have people like Stephen. If there was no default, you wouldn't need a bank, because everyone could borrow or lend at the single riskless interest rate. And you wouldn't need money, because my IOU would be just as good as the Bank of England's IOU. In fact, it would be sort of effectively identical. And what's more, you see, there'd be no fraud in this world of DSGE. And that means there's no finance. So there are no financial frictions. And one of the problems with the DSGE models is that the real frictions that really drive the big ups and downs are not, I'm afraid, Kondratiev waves. They are much more the financial crises that affected us in 1929, in the interwar period, and affected us again in 2008, 2009. And, you know, what does Kondratiev have got to do with financial crises and world wars and all the rest of it? Schumpeter, yes. Kondratiev, no. And finally, the other sort of last major problem of macroeconomics is that it ought to be an empirical science. And actually, it's not macroeconomics for essentially two reasons. And they're both is that it's too hard to do. And we can't do controlled experiments. Think what medicine would be like if you couldn't do controlled experiments. Think what almost any of the sciences would be like if you couldn't do controlled experiments. And it extraordinarily difficult. And it's not only that you can't do controlled experiments, it's that the effect of your experiments changes the way that people understand the world in which they live, and therefore changes the way that they behave. So even if you could do a controlled experiment, the outcome of that controlled experiment would change people's understanding of the world, which would mean that it wouldn't necessarily work in exactly the same way the next time. So it's really quite extraordinarily difficult to do. And we don't know where we are. We certainly don't know how to forecast. It's rather a sad scene. It's very difficult to know where one ought to go, but maybe the first thing to do is to try and get some proper financial frictions, some proper understanding of the interaction between finance and macroeconomics into the models that we use. But the main thing to do tonight is to buy Meghnad's book.
Not read, just buy.
No. The Meghnad's criticism of present macroeconomics is absolutely marvelous, and Schumpeter and Wicksell I think are wonderful, but Kondratiev is for the birds.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much.
Shall I open to the floor, or do you want to come back now?
Why don't you go to the floor and then you...
Okay, so what we're going to do is open to the floor. Anyone who wishes to offer a more optimistic take on the state of macroeconomics is very welcome to chip in with it as we discuss. So I'm seeing one question at the back, and then what we'll do is Meghnad will respond a little bit to what we've heard already, and we'll sort of get a discussion
Let's see the
going.
questions
So
together.
one at the back there and one in the middle there. I'm aware that there's a mic for the top. So if you pass the mic along that row as well, we'll take three together, and then Meghnad will come in. Yeah.
Towards the end of his
Actually, could you say who you are before you ask your question?
My name is Serge Ramin. I work in the finance industry. Towards the end of his intervention, Professor Goodhart has alluded to the to frictions and to the problem of fraud. Two of the crises that were referenced by Mr. King had to do with fraud at their heart. When you talk about the dot-com bubble, there were a series of fraudulent transactions, capacity sales that were boosting reported sales of companies. There were statements about growth of demand which were proven to be false. When you talk about the housing crisis, there was significant fraudulent origination of mortgages. And all these transactions, all these fraud which were perpetrated had massive impact in terms of people's perception of how the economy was doing. So my question, given that those two crises that were recent had fraud at their heart, is what can macro teach us about how to detect fraud, or how fraud is built into macro assumptions?
Okay, good. We're going to bring the mic to this gentleman here, but meanwhile, I think you've already got it up there, so why don't you go ahead?
Hi, my name is Arasa. I work in the investment bank. I'm just wondering, what economists do to communicate more effectively their knowledge and views to the public, especially here in the UK. So even if you had predicted it, we don't really hear much from you. I think maybe we allow the politicians to tell too much of the tale.
Okay, and then down here. This way, not the economists.
I'm Lawrence Simons. I live here in London. You talk quite a lot about bubbles, and bubbles are, I think, as we all know, are quite easy to spot once they've burst. But I'm just wondering whether you can see any bubbles inflating now, and where they would be.
Okay, so Meghnad, you perhaps come in, and I'll invite Charles and Stephen also if they wish to add anything. But
Well, sort of also around what Stephen and Charles said. It's very difficult for people to incorporate history of things like bubbles, the collapse of dot-com boom and so on, back into the theory, because it will require a major revision of the theory. It's much easier to say that was a random shock. And that random shock we can discount. You see, to be slightly theoretical, in a well-raised economy, nothing can happen. Once you start Big Bang, equilibrium is established, not only now, but forever and ever. How do you explain movements in time series if you're a well-Raysian? It have to be random. So the new classical economics says there are supply shocks and there are demand shocks. And sometimes the supply curve gets shocked, and so you generate it. But all movements are self-reversing. Now, none of the financial market stuff is in the new classical macroeconomics. There's sort of one bond, and they talk about micro foundation, but there's one consumer who is infinitely time replicated. So in kind of you get things. Now, we just haven't had any relationship of theory to practice in terms of financial markets. There is a finance theory, there is economic theory, and they have not kind of merged together. Finance theory was influenced very powerfully by economists saying markets are efficient. And I explain in my book how we got into that theory, markets efficient. So, Robert Shiller, for example, did warn about irrational exuberance. And he was saying that before the dot-com boom collapsed, this is a bubble which will collapse. But nobody took that seriously. And when the dot-com boom did collapse, I don't think economists ever felt, oh God, this is a serious challenge to a theory. Economists don't see any serious challenge. Even now, much of the standard macroeconomics does not see any challenge to the theory in terms of what happened in the recession. Because internally the logic explains that not being able to predict is part of the strength of the theory. And it's, maybe you probably want to come back to that. In a sense, the great thing about politicians and economists is politicians want quick answers. I have been on the periphery of politics, and I've often talked economics to politicians, but we had a colleague called Alan Walters here, who was a professor of monetary economics here, and he was advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And Alan had this ability, the Prime Minister asked you a question, now what do you think of such and such? You had to give an answer, which was within the ballpark. It may be between 35% to 65% right. If next day you said, Prime Minister, I was saying to you yesterday, I have done some further research and I have got a better answer, she would say, that was yesterday. I'm not interested. I've got another problem now. And so the politicians very often, their perspective in terms of problem, and Alan Walters told me this himself about, I think. This is also another situation. I'm telling stories. I'll tell you a story. When the Falklands War about to erupt, Alan Walters went to Margaret Thatcher and said, Prime Minister, I have done a careful analysis of this. And he said, there are these 2,000 people living in the Falkland Islands. I said, why don't we give them the following option? That if they leave, we give them £1 million. If they want to stay, then we will abandon the effect. It will only cost, X billion. And he said, I thought, Margaret Thatcher believed in the market and so on. He says, Margaret Thatcher looked at me witheringly. She said, Professor, it is not a question of money. So, politicians think very, very differently. They have very different time horizon, and they don't really have patience for the correct answer. Even if they want. It's fast food. Now, there is something called the bubbles. What was it with the bubbles?
Fraud.
Yeah, you're saying
Fraud. Question about fraud.
Oh, fraud, yeah. Well, one of the amazing thing about economists, they not only don't read history, they probably don't even read novels. at least in English economics, if you go through the 19th century, there's a big suspicion of banks and bankers and markets because, both right-wing radicals and left-wing radicals had no faith in these people's probity or honesty. All bankers, were frauds. In America, the further out west you go, further out southwest you go, they believe all bankers are fraudsters. Very, very strong belief. They will only accept cash, they will not accept any checks. And so we have somehow made banking much more respectable lately. People have forgotten about frauds. But as Charles was saying, to believe that nobody is going to renege or default is far too much. Now, one of the things I would say, and this partly covers what Charles was saying, you see, the picture, because I also read a lot of somewhat unscientific left-wing literature, Marx and so on. Marx's picture was that capitalism has to go through cycles of overvaluation, and only a crisis can clean up the system and let the overvalued people go bankrupt, and then you start all over again. So disequilibrium is part of the way the system reproduces itself, survives by going up and down. If it didn't go up and down, it would not be able to cure the bad eggs out of the system. So, he had a thing called fictitious capital. Some other thing about the fraud was fictitious capital. Now, in a sense, the way capitalism has worked for 250 years is, people have built fortunes, gone out of business, done inventions and so on. And finance and economics have been very intimately related in real life. The fact that economists have not done it, that's another story. And so this particular crisis, 2008, has been much more blatant about banking fraud than anything that we remember, So maybe we will learn more about how to integrate fraud into our analysis. And, no idea. One more thing I want to say about what Charles was saying about the optimistic days of macroeconomics, when we were both young and hopeful, optimistic. I remember being at a meeting in American Economic Association, and Robert Solow, later on Nobel Prize winner, he said, we now have the models and we now have the computers. There are no problems left to solve in macroeconomics. 1964. And there was here the idea that if you can design if you can model the economy as like a servo mechanism, you can then have optimal control theory applied to that. And at Queen Mary College, there was a program, this is 40 years ago, which even went on television, where Professor Maurice Beston and another man called Kent Wall, and there was a MP whose name will come to me, very good sort of mathematician. They had a public program and said, public only has to give us their targets and their desires, and we will integrate that into our model and give you the answer what the policy should be to achieve those. I mean, this is 1972, before oil price quadrupled. But there was a lot of hope. People thought that, yes, we can think of the economy as a machine. We design a model of how the machine works, and then we can design how to make the machine work in such a way that there'll never be any disturbances.
Okay, we'll go for another round of questions, but I can't help but remark at this point that for those who haven't seen it, they should go to the Science Museum and see the Phillips machine.
Oh, Phillips machine, yes.
So Bill Phillips, who Meghnad referred to earlier, literally designed a machine to model the economy. And
I actually talk about that in my book.
Yeah, and you can go, if you wish, and see the original Phillips machine sitting there in a glass case. One of the first pre-computer. It was a physical machine.
Computer, yeah.
Okay, we're going to have another round of questions. So I'm seeing a question down here, and I'm going to go up the top, and then another one down here on the end. Okay, so we'll go along the row here, then on the end of the row, right at the front. There, that's right. Just there, and then.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start here.
My name is Raj Bansali. I am an Emeritus Professor of Statistics at Liverpool University and a visiting professor at Imperial. I had the pleasure of being taught by Meghnad in my second year undergraduate at LSE when he had applied econometrics, and also writing a joint paper with Charles Goodhart on. But anyway, my question is, at some point, you describe various ills with economics as a discipline and where it's lost its way. I think at some point, economists decided that there should be a science. And that probably led them to produce testable hypotheses, which data did not always support. Perhaps you would comment how justified was that pathway, and should we remain on that or move more towards behavioral economics?
Okay, question up the top there.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Desai. I am an ignorant student of economics, and therefore I would like to learn from case studies. When you mentioned that microeconomics should work well, and thereafter you don't need macroeconomics, if I rightly understood you, if we consider the case of Japan as a micro and a macro economy, the level of efficiencies they have in their social structures, in their institutions, which are reflective of the culture and the norms of that particular social structure. Yet, I am slightly perplexed that they are having macroeconomic issues. They have 200% their debt is internal debt. Is 200% of their GDP. So where is a healthy balance? Or how to, I mean, if I understood your statement correctly, the significance of micro measures on the macro measures. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then there was down the front here.
Toby Chambers from Goldsmiths. It was really great to have a breath of fresh air. I think kind of revisiting a lot of the old theories is incredibly refreshing. Do you think heterodox economics is going to be on the rise and we're going to see a big sea change in the discourse?
Okay, and I'll invite Charles and Stephen
Okay.
also.
Yeah, I think there is no alternative but to go on trying to make it a science. Because in a sense, otherwise you're being irresponsible. What else can you do? You can't suddenly get up every morning and think of a new idea and that's my new theory. At some stage, the theory has to confront some sort of systematic test. And I don't, very often and this is going into some technical stuff, I think in a sense, economists pretend that they are very mathematical, but their mathematics is very simple. The mathematics is not complex enough for the subject. And we parade around saying, oh, this is very model. Most of our models are linear. And most of our statistical distributions are normal. And we then can go around parading as if we've done something great. Now, it may be that one of the things we ought to be more like scientists. And like Charles said about medicine. In medicine, you can't experiment. But the amount of progress there has been, for example, in study of the brain. I mean, it's astonishing. And we haven't been able to match empirical studies of the economy with anything like the intensity with which the medical people have done it. I think in May, one of the things I appeal for is we ought to get more empirical studies back into economics, which we have. So that may not be the. Now, let me tell you, firstly, I was making a theoretical point that if you believe in microeconomics, you don't need macroeconomics, theoretically, because microeconomics gives you answer of price and quantity in all the markets. You add up, and that is the total economy. Total economy is a sum of everything. And therefore, for a really strict micro foundation person, macroeconomics is just, superficial topping of it. Now, in Japan and what happened in Japan and so on is another very interesting story in terms of quite a lot of people were saying, are we going to get into a Japanese type situation? Are we right now in a Japanese type situation? And what happens? What happened, for example, when the stock market, as Charles, and as Stephen was saying, there is a thing in which if you get into overvaluation of assets, and then when that boom collapses, it may turn out that people will not be able to find a way out of that thing, which is again the situation in Japan. Why it happened, we're all trying to understand. Bernanke has studied and so on. It is Japan got into one of these, if I may be allowed to say contractive again, it's one of these long cycles. I go on about contractive. I think Stephen is quite right. There are only 6 complete cycles. And indeed, I say in my book that you cannot have a statistically reliable model when there are only 6 cycles. That's fine. But as a heuristic device, we really ought to understand why economies get into long periods of recession or depression or whatever you call it. We are, in my view, about to get into one of those periods, and we're going to stay there like some time. So if that, we don't actually understand why. Kondratiev only dated. He didn't just give us a theory of how the turning point comes, where it happens. Now, he said, demographics and politics and so on. Bits of theory in Marx, bits of theory in Schumpeter, bits of theory in Wicksell, but nobody has integrated. Give me £20 million and I'll set up a research center and hire people to build this model that I want to build. But, again, going back to the first question, this is a very serious enterprise. It has to be cooperative, it has to be always forward-looking, and it has to be rigorous. Just because I can tell an interesting story doesn't make me right. We have to actually take the data and take as much data as possible, use the best techniques, and get the best minds. Now, it may be that behavioral economics will give us a better answer, but even behavioral economics has got to be tested. It's got to be a testable hypothesis. Come on.
So, is there one further? Oh, the question about heterodox economics.
Heterodox. I spent the flower of my youth talking about heterodox economics. I was one of the few people who knew all the different heterodoxes in economics. There are post-Keynesians, neo-Marxians, Austrians. And there is something called École de Dijon, where they had very peculiar views on money. I think mainstream economics treats these people with contempt. Just does not listen to them. We succeeded, I shouldn't say we, because as a sort of a heterodox movement, we succeeded in getting some really heterodox people professorships in some respectable universities. Very hard work, I can tell you that. I cheated because I wrote this conventional econometrica type article, so I was allowed to do Marxian economics. It's all right, but he writes decent stuff as well. So we don't have to worry about what he writes on Marx. So I got away with it. But quite a lot who seriously did heterodox work, they found it very difficult in their career to convince their departments that they should be promoted because their colleagues were saying, but this is nonsense. You don't get into good journals. And so there's all this thing about Thomas Kuhn and scientific revolutions and Popper and all that. We've been through all this. But the surprising thing is that economics right now does not think itself into a crisis, in my view.
Anything to say? Should we? I think we have. Yeah, Stephen.
Just a couple of things. First of all, on your question about fraud, I work for a bank, so I'm sorry. Charles secretly works for a bank to a certain degree, but fraud is a feature of the capitalist system. It's a feature of financial bubbles and busts, and Charles Kindleberger in Megnad's Panics and Crashes describes the fraudulent activities that occurs across all these various examples. So that fraud, in one sense, shouldn't come as a surprise. It's not something that's desirable, of course, but the fact that it repeats itself regularly, particularly in the 19th century and so on, is not a surprise. in one sense, the surprise is that we think it's a surprise when actually it's something that happens with some degree of regularity. And I think there's also a fairly obvious microeconomic explanation for some of it, which is that there's massive asymmetries of information in the financial system, that some people are in a more privileged position than others. They can manipulate the situation to earn economic rents, and the people left picking up the pieces, pensioners 20, 30 years down the road, cannot easily connect what their losses might be with the activities of people within the financial system many years earlier. But the fact of the matter is that it happens fairly regularly, and in one sense it's a failure of economists not to incorporate these sudden losses of trust, these moments of panic into their economic models. So I think that's one observation to make. Secondly, on the question on Japan, I think this is a really interesting question about macro versus micro, actually, because it is a real life debate going on currently, to the extent that the former BOJ governor, Shirakawa-san, was someone who clearly believed that many of Japan's difficulties were micro rather than macro. He was resistant to the idea of offering massive macro stimulus because he believed that weaknesses were associated with, for example, hollowing out of Japanese industry because of low-cost producers elsewhere in Asia, for example, demographic change, for example, the attitude towards women in the workforce, a whole bunch of things that contributed to a loss of momentum in Japan that had nothing really to do with QE or zero interest rates or fiscal stimulus. He lost his job in part because of that series of beliefs. Kuroda-san comes in, who offers more a macroeconomic view, but so far the evidence actually has not been particularly helpful for him, because there was massive QE in 2013, much greater than most people expected. Those who strongly believed in this kind of stimulus argued it would really lead to much faster growth in 2013, 2014. I just wanted to sort of end by showing how useless forecasts are. So at the beginning of 2013, the consensus forecast for Japanese growth for 2014 was growth of 1% in real terms. After QE, when the stock market began to boom, that forecast was revised up from 1 to 1.7% for 2014, which by Japanese standards is pretty good. The actual outcome for last year was 0. In other words, there seems to be no connection between what is a very large macro stimulus and the impact on the economy, which raises, I think, some interesting questions about the macro versus micro debate.
Just add one tiny comment. Don't assume that fraud is concentrated only among bankers. What do you think that you are doing when you write your CVs?
Well, on that thought, I think I'll draw matters to a close.
Before we get into any further
Exactly.
trouble.
So I hope, I'm sure I speak for us all when I say what a stimulating and interesting discussion. I was reminded of one thing as I was listening, that when my first job was at Princeton, when I was taken aside when I was making my first reading list by a senior colleague who said, for heaven's sake, don't put anything on the reading list that's more than 5 years old. Otherwise, you're bound to get the criticism from the students that the reading list is out of date. And I think what we've been offered by our panelists today is the need for perspective, historical perspective, for actually getting out there and reading things that have been written in the past, if necessary, bringing them up to date with evidence and ideas that are contemporary. But I think it's a really dangerous thing when we believe that all the knowledge that's worth knowing was created only in the last few years. And listening to our distinguished panel, I think should make us all want to, first of all, rush outside and get a signed copy of Meghnad's book, but more to read widely and to form the kind of intelligent and really stimulating perspective that we've heard from all three panelists this evening. So thank you very much to all three.
Very nice.